come from the Ark Encounter up in Kentucky, which was built a few years ago. And I'll tell you right now a number of things. Number one, there are disclaimers that they have put around this because it is not strictly the way that Noah built it, okay? They had to because of state fire laws and things of this nature. So things of that nature make it not exact. But you will get an idea of the size of this thing and some information that I hope to pass along to you. And you can see exactly what we're dealing with. I hope we can answer some questions tonight that you may have and haven't thought about for a while. But anyway, I apologize too for some of the quality of these pictures. We were very crowded at the time, and some of these pictures are a little bit blurry that I made from the inside. So I apologize in advance, but I'll try to answer any questions or comments, whatever. If you have them, please speak up and let me know. Before we get started, I've asked Brother Hayden if he would to read Genesis chapter 6, verses 13 through 22 for us, please.
And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shall set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come to the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort, shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female, of fowls of their kind, and of the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. And take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he.
Thank you, Brother Hayden. Before we begin tonight, I'd also like to ask Brother Ray if you would mind leading us in a word of prayer before we begin, please.
Most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this another day of life, another opportunity we have to come out and study a portion of our word, Father. Father, we ask you to please be with us as we go throughout this class, because again, much from it we apply to our lives, Father, and share with others at that time and opportunity. Father, we ask you to please be with those who have been mentioned tonight as being sick, those who have special needs, those who have upcoming surgeries. We ask you, Father, please be with them, be the doctors and nurses, everything that can be done to them on every day, Father. Father, we ask you to please be with our country, help us to always look to thee for guidance. Please be with the leaders of our nation, Father, and turn to thee and look to thee, and always enact laws that give us the freedom to worship thee without fear of any man. Father, we ask you to forgive us for our sins in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Okay. This is a picture of the ark, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to give you some context as to actually how big this is in a little bit, but I've got some other slides I'm going to show you as we go on. This was me and Nina standing down at the end of this thing, and we were probably a good 100, 125 foot away from it. And you see it still didn't get all in the frame. This thing is huge. And again, this thing was not built according to scripture, okay? They even have disclaimers for that fact. You have to understand this is for entertainment here. It does have a very religious significance to it, but it was built and designed as kind of a theme park that people could go into. And it was very interesting in the way that they had done it. Now this ark right here is the largest timber frame structure in the world. To give you some idea as to how big it is. I want to get into several things. They had a number of displays inside the ship that we looked at. And they had animals in cages. They weren't real, they were stuffed. They had food. They showed where they would have had their food. There were just numerous pots that were made from pottery that would have contained grain and other things that they would have carried along the way. This was real interesting to me. Of course, I had known this for some time, but there are over 200 stories of variations of the flood within different cultures. There's the Babylonian, which a lot of people have heard of Gilgamesh. That's probably the most popular story. And then there's the Aztec Indians, the Chinese have one, the Sumerians have one, even the American Indians have one. There are numerous stories. Like I said, there's over 200. So the thing comes up is, how could something this prevalent be this widespread and not be true? Now, they do differ quite a bit in different ways, but the basic theme of each of the stories is there was a giant flood that covered the earth. A man built a ship, boat, raft, whatever, and he saved humanity and the animals along with it. So they're all differing in their different ways and what caused it and why and all that. But they're all basically the same premise behind them. And I found that very interesting that they had covered several instances of this in there. Now, it talks about the flooded with legends. Also, we've talked about, I know Brother Micah has done an excellent job on the class in here on Genesis. And approximately 2,000 years have passed by the time God brings his flood on the earth. Here's what some of the population could be. At just a simple 1.1% growth, there could have been 147,551,508 people on the earth. And you can see at 1.2, you have increased greatly. Then at 1.3, you've got 3 billion. And at 1.4%, you've got almost 20 billion people on the earth that would have been killed during this flood. We don't know exactly how many people were on the earth, but I appreciated them putting up this population chart and the possibility of what the population could have been at that time. So we know it was a devastating flood that killed a bunch of people. Aliens and pyramids, they get into some other things there, even into the Babel Legends. Now, there are a number of legends that go along with the Tower of Babel. I didn't realize there were as many as they were. But different cultures of men building a tower to heaven and a change of languages also are found in different cultures. There's too many things that are coincidence here that, you know, if you're looking for proof, it's out there. And these are just a few of the things that they come up with. They also go into the Table of Nations here with Noah, Shem, Ham, and Jacob. And this is a chart, and those of you that were in my class, if you've got those books that I handed out, the lesson planners, if you will look in there, there is a sheet with the different descendants from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the nationalities that they pretty much founded in their traveling. So they get into several things here. The origin of languages. And they kind of compare a biblical model with an evolutionary model, which is not exactly right, according to the way evolution is planned it, or explains it. But when you have one common language that men used, and then God scattered people, he did use, and if you'll notice today, some of the words that we use have Latin derivatives, some of them have German derivatives, different nationalities. You can see in our language, different words have different nationalities behind them in their language. So they all, you can tell, came from one language. Climate change. This was something else that they had several displays on, and I was very impressed with the way they had it. Of course, after the flood, you know there's going to be a drastic change in our climate. They're going to go from a tropical zone into different types of climates. And it's interesting, I had found an article and I couldn't find it to bring it tonight. I wish I had. But scientists here within the last few months discovered tropical plants off the coast of Antarctica, underwater. Tropical plants in Antarctica. Now, how did they get there? Anyhow, something that is very interesting, you can see from this chart right here, in between the years 800 and 1200 AD, they had global warming. Believe it or not, our climate cycles. Also, from 1440 to 1880 AD, right along in here, they had a cooling period. They called it a little ice age. So, everybody that's whooping and hollering carried on about global warming today, our climate cycles, and it does so since the flood. This is what created the change. When we lost that canopy around the earth of water vapor, we've lost the impact of the protection that it gave us from infrared rays and different things that are coming from outer space that can cause aging. That's why you've seen a great decrease in the age span after the flood. But we've already had some of these. Here's an example. In 1942, 6 P-38 fighter planes and 2 B-17 bombers were forced to land on the ice in Greenland. The planes were abandoned and practically forgotten nearly 40 years. Later, a search was made to recover the planes, but they were not located until 1988, when advanced radar spotted them 250 feet below the ice. Now, just 40 short years and they're 250 feet below the ice. As a matter of fact, they recovered one of them and it has been rebuilt and they're flying it today. So, climate change is not something new. And God is in control. Let's always remember that. A lot of questions have come up about how did all the animals make it and how did people make it after the flood? Why did they all get around? Well, with this ice age, there were land bridges. And they were traveling across those. That's how they could have easily gotten to different places. Now, we know that glaciers have caused a change in our landscape in many areas. We understand that. But in the years that have passed, these land bridges have disappeared and melted. And these natural bridges and so on have disappeared. And now you see water in between and think, well, how in the world could they have got there? Very simple. After that flood, a number of things changed drastically that would have brought it about. These displays, like I said, are all throughout the boat. And they have got them in there to where there's some real interesting stuff if you take the time to stop and read. Extent of the Ice Age. Grand Canyon. This is one evolutionists love to point to. They say, okay, this was caused over millions of years of slow water erosion and the disintegration of rock soil during this time. But there's a problem. In this strata, there are certain layers. Of course, we know that the strata is supposed to represent a time period for each level, okay? In the strata of the Grand Canyon, there's several of them missing. Well, how did that happen? How does time erase a whole era? These are known as paraconformities. This is what the evolutionists will use when their theory doesn't match up. A conformity is when they're all together. They're all like they're supposed to be. But these paraconformities are different from the fact that they don't line up with all the strata in the time frame that they're supposed to. You can see there millions of years without erosion. When you're dealing in millions of years and you've got missing strata, you've got a big problem, a real big problem. Warped rocks, rock layer sequences deposited rapidly before being bent. All of this matches up. Now, Brother Gilbert has read it, I know, and I'm sure some of you others have, but there's a book out called The Genesis Flood. John Wickham and Dr. Henry Morris have written this book, and it is excellent. They have tackled every single angle of the scientific levels on the flood and everything that was around it. And they have proven that everything, the Bible is in total accord with the situation as it is today. The evolutionists do have some problems in areas, but the Bible is not in conflict with science. And that's the thing that we need to emphasize so much. Fossils, cross-continent deposition. There are sediment layers that are deposited across several continents that do not match up with the evolutionary theory. They say that this all had to come about gradually, but after the flood, the deposits would have been pretty quick, and it doesn't line up with their theory. Here is a polystrate fossil. That's a tree, a fossilized tree, and you can see the different layers of strata while that tree was standing. It was still standing, so we know that it occurred fairly quickly, because that couldn't have happened over millions of years and that tree still stands. It wouldn't have happened. Also, rapid fossil formation. There are cases of just literally thousands of animals that were deposited and buried alive, and millions of years are not going to account for that. It had to be something that occurred quickly, like flood. Also, mothers and babies were buried alive at the same time. So it shows that a flood actually occurred. The proof is there. Now this one's the one that really gets me. You got the earth that's covered by water. You got Mars that hasn't got a drop on it. But the scientists say there was a flood on Mars and it was entirely covered with water, but the earth never had a flood like this that covered the earth. Now explain that one to me. But we know different. We know what the Bible teaches, and we believe God's word rather than men's theories. More evidence for a flood on Mars. I've talked about this a lot in the class, Catastrophism versus universalism. I mean, uniformitarianism. I get my isms messed up here. Catastrophism is something that occurred that is a great catastrophe that could have occurred that caused problems, which would be, in this case, the flood. The uniformitarianism states that the earth in the past is operating like it does today. Everything's like it is today. Nothing's really drastic. You may have had a volcano here and there, and you may have had this and that, but nothing of a major catastrophic nature. But that kind of goes against their own theory of how a meteor hit the earth and destroyed all the dinosaurs. So they can't even get their story straight. But it goes into a lot of information here, and I won't get too involved with this about it. And you can see there were a lot of people. The lady walked in front of me while I was taking a picture. So, uniformitarianism states that the simpler forms were buried because they hadn't evolved yet. They were in the lower strata, and then they advanced as they went up. When a flood occurred and animals were buried, the simpler animals are going to be at the bottom of the sea. They were the first ones buried. Then as you go on up through the water column, you get a little more complex until you reach land, and then you get even more complex. Very simple. It's not rocket science. But this is the way they try to use to progress, and they will show this in the school books, and they will preach this as the truth, that man evolved. This is how he came about. He started as a little creature and eventually evolved into what we are today. This is where, this was one of the displays I found kind of interesting. It's a temple to a golden idol god that they supposedly were worshiping and talking about the evil that occurred right before the flood. This was the reason God sent the flood. And it was a real elaborate model. I was impressed with the way they had done it. But it just gives a little showing of what man could have been like before, when his thoughts were evil continually, for the reason God brought this flood. Now here he's talking about the artistic interpretation, and this is some of the stuff that I have talked about earlier. Everything is not as the Bible says. They did take some artistic interpretation of it to make it a little different. Here's some of the animals. That they had them showing up in different little cages, and it was pretty neat the way they had it all laid out. This was one of the little critters that's supposed to have been one of the earlier whales that had legs and walked and then went back to the water. He come out of the water, he learned to walk, and then he decided he'd go back to the water because he didn't like it, I guess. Evolutionary shortcomings. These are, let's see. Okay. This gives a display of the speciation within kinds. You remember in chapter 1, God said he made each thing after its own kind. Well, that's where the proof is. All these creatures evolved through their own kind. And evolved just simply means changed. but they do not change from one species into another. Okay? You're not going to have a chicken turning into a cow. I'm sorry. It just ain't going to happen. And these all occurred, and they have a good display there showing how that there's no proof of anything ever changing from one species to another. So many animals, so many species there. The total number of animals that is projected to have been on board the ark would have been approximately 7,000, give or take, that Noah and his family would have had to tend to. And we're going to look at that. How would they be able to take care of all them? Here's some of the animals. Some of them you'll recognize. And it was kind of dark in there, so some of them didn't turn out as well as I'd hoped. But you can see they even had some dinosaurs on board. Now this is what I found really fascinating. And again, they took an artistic impression here. This doesn't mean this is the way it occurred, but people say, well, how in the world did they carry all that water and food on there? How in the world did they dispose of all that waste? Okay, this is just a simple could have been, not a definite. The water would have been caught up here, as you can see up there in these cisterns up on the top. They could have captured rainwater very easily up there, and through the use of bamboo, they could have piped it down to the animals. They could have used it to do the watering with. Now, I thought it was kind of ingenious the way they done this as far as getting rid of the waste. The liquid waste, they also could have piped through. And this thing right here, they're showing, you see this little bamboo tube here. It would have captured it and brought it over to this device, which would have carried it up and dumped it in here. And the solid waste, they would have cleaned out into wheelbarrows and dumped it. And it would have come up through this process and been dumped out here into this water, where it would have, they could have had a hole above the water line where it would have fed back out in outside the boat. Now the way this thing was working is they had an elephant up there on a treadmill, and he was the one that was walking along and turning this thing. And it was so neat to see, and I thought, you know, that is a possibility that they could have done it that way. I'm not saying that it is. There's no definitive, but this is simply a possibility. Things could have been done to take care of all of this. And the skeptics won't say, nah, you know, you couldn't get rid of all that stuff. You can't feed them well enough. All right, here, the large animals, well, I've got another. Well, I don't see it. Anyway, I think I've got another picture here a little later on. I'll show you a way that they possibly, yeah, here it is. I went past it. They could have built a mezzanine structure up above the cages. The water would have been fed through, like up here, and down into a trough. Also their feed, they could have fed it in here. You can see the animals eating out from down here. It would have been much easier having to take the time to go open the door and move the animal out of the way, put it in. They just walk around, drop their feed, drop their water, and so on. So there are a number of things that could have been possible on the ark that would have made it easier for them to handle all these animals. These are some more of the animals. Now this right here, this was standing on the first floor looking up, and they had a sunlight that was all the way down the thing. And I know Noah didn't have steel bolts and nuts and washers and things like that, but I was glad to see him when I walked through this thing because it's huge. But it's amazing to stand there and look up and see just how far up all of this is and how big this thing is. They had some maps that kind of told us where we were at. Of course, I know Noah wouldn't have had snack bars, he wouldn't have had a theater or anything like that. Here's a model of the boat that they have broke down, and kind of give you an overview to it to see on a smaller scale. There were maps showing us where to get around to, what was where, and so on. And in the theater, they even had, they had done a video and showed us a play of how the world could have been at the time, and of Noah, and you know, just how evil people were. And it was interesting. It was interesting to see. The view of the ark, this was when they built it. They got the approval in 2010. They started in 2014 and completed in 2016. Now, they compare Noah's ark from what the scriptures say to what they did. And there is some difference. And as far as the timber or the lumber in there, what they built the majority of this out of was Douglas fir. And I don't think that was gopher wood, but that's what they built it with. Here's a list of the animals, and there's the, again, there's the lumber that they were using. They used a little different wood inside on some of this, but different animals and so on. The average size of the animal was going to be that of the size of a sheep. So you're not talking all kinds of huge animals. Yes, there were a few large ones, but the average size was not that big. Again, a breakdown of the boat and how that they had it laid out. Everything in there fits. They went through, they did some studies on this and surveys. It's very easy to show how that this thing could have handled all these animals. Now, get back. Was the ark shaped like a box? Strong's Hebrew word tiva means box or chest. Easton's Bible Dictionary also says that it would have been, that word means box or chest. Studies were done at the University of Michigan State in their hydrological department, and they took a box-shaped boat and they put it in this wave machine, and they run these big waves over it to see how that it would have affected it, and it handled it tremendously. Now, as you've seen the picture when you first come in on how the ark was, it was built like a boat with a bow and stern and all that. But the thing is, that boat was not going anywhere particular. It's not like it had to be steered. All they had to do was get Noah and the animals up above the water and keep them safe and then land them. So they weren't going anywhere. And that's why, personally, I believe that's what it was like. I believe it was more of a barge situation than it was like this boat. But that's my personal opinion. The cubit. Now, This ark was built on the cubit. The cubit ranges from anywhere from 17.5 inches all the way up to 20.6. They used what is known as the royal cubit of 20.4 inches. Now, I measured my own, and a cubit is from the tip of the elbow to the tip of the longest finger. My cubit is 18.5 inches. So somebody else would be different. They said on a 20.4 inches, if that's what it was built on, the original ark, Noah would have been about 6'4", 6'3" in height. So to have a cubit of that size. With a cubit of that size, 20.4, the length of the boat is 510 foot long. It is 85 foot wide and 51 foot tall. It is a huge boat. Some more of the animals. Okay. I want to go back. Now that was the end of it, like I was showing you before, where Donna and I were standing down there. As a matter of fact, they got a gift shop underneath there. We bought several things. Got some good books too. But this is the ark. And here's another one. And another one. Alright, this is me standing here. I'm quite a ways from the ark actually. But I'm going to give you a little better picture. Remember this green shirt right here? Can you see me?
Barely.
That's me right there. And I'm still standing 30 or 40 foot in front of this thing. When I seen this ship, I said, there's no way anybody could deny he couldn't get all them animals on there. This thing is humongous. He had plenty of room to get the animals on there. We went through, they even showed, they had displays in there of where their living quarters would have been. Him, his sons, their wives, and so on and so forth, all the way through. They had their, and they had plenty of room in there for that. The food that they carried, they had plenty of storage for it. We just seen rows and rows of, like I said, these pottery clay pots that were about yay big. They were about that big around. And I mean, they had plenty of food they could have fed these animals with, and the water that they could have given them. So if anybody says that Noah's Ark is not something that is feasible, they're wrong. Because this thing is quite huge. Now that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Well, Joe, just a word on just how important this actually is. It gets down to like all of this is facts.
Right.
We're trying to lay out evidence while the other side wants to try to beat us down and make us feel small by theorizing.
Yeah.
And the propaganda of it is pushed in all areas. Like as you're going through this, I'm thinking about shows and movies that I was watching as a little child. The first thing that came to mind was Land Before Time.
Yeah.
You know, Littlefoot and all these little characters that I watched. And what are they pushing? They're pushing that exact agenda. And if we're not careful as to what type of, how much of that information we allow to come in without some type of rebuttal back from it, we'll start slowly giving credence to it. Or I guess nowadays it's not really so much a slow movement of giving credence to it as it is people just ready to give it wholesale.
Well, they have brought out so many things. You can't watch a nature show without hearing the word millions of years thrown in there somewhere. It's constant. even in cartoons. I was amazed at catching some of the cartoons that were starting. Bugs Bunny, even back in the 40s when it was done, was talking about how the Big Bang came about, and millions of years later we're here. And our kids are being induced with this every day. They're being hit with it, and after a while you just accept it. The old adage of, if you tell a lie long enough, people will believe it, is coming true. Because I guarantee you, you can walk down the streets of Savannah, stop somebody there and say, how old is the earth? Well, I don't know, millions of years old, but I don't know exactly. But they're going to throw it out in millions of years probably, or billions. And we're being taught this, it's being shoved down our throat, and this is simply facts that are coming about that we want to emphasize. The Bible is not in conflict with science, and that's what the evolutionists are trying to do, is prove that that the Bible is in conflict with it, but it's not. Good point, thanks. Anybody else?
How many years approximately from time the ark landed to our place? Any idea? Or from that on the call Abraham? I just wonder what the population might be by the time Abraham was called. There were a lot of people.
Yeah.
God had scattered people over the earth.
That's right. I can't give you right off the top of my head that age. I know that it was like 4 or 5 generations, something like that, from the time
It's a good while.
down to Nimrod, when they started the building of it. So there could have been a lot more people. I think there's more people there than what we really understand nowadays. I appreciate your attention. My 2 little grandbabies.